August 1945. 1 week after Japan's surrender, a cargo ship arrived at the port of San Francisco, carrying an unusual and controversial cargo. 38 Japanese women, captured during the final months of the war while working as nurses, radio operators, and support staff for the Imperial Japanese military. They had spent weeks at sea in cramped conditions, convinced they were being transported to their execution. Many had been told by their captors that American soldiers would torture and kill them. Some had attempted suicide rather than face capture. But when they arrived at the temporary processing facility near San Diego, they were given something completely unexpected. Something so simple, so ordinary to Americans, that it would become one of the most powerful symbols of the transformation that compassion could create. They were given chocolate. The moment one of these women, a 23-year-old former battlefield nurse named Akiko Tanaka, placed a piece of milk chocolate on her tongue and felt it melt, something inside her broke open. She began to cry, not from sadness or fear, but from the complete disorientation of discovering that everything she had been told about her enemy was a lie. Before we reveal how something as simple as chocolate became a turning point in these women, his understanding of America, tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. The women had been captured in the final weeks before Japan's surrender, taken from various locations across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Theater. They were not soldiers in any traditional sense. They were nurses who had worked in field hospitals, administrative staff who had coordinated supply lines, communicators who had relayed orders, women who had volunteered to serve their country in whatever capacity they could. The youngest was 18. The oldest was 42. They came from every region of Japan, from Tokyo to Osaka to rural villages whose names few Americans would ever know. Akiko Tanaka was from Hiroshima. She had been a nursing student when the war began, and like many young Japanese women, she had felt it was her patriotic duty to serve. She had seen horrific wounds, had held dying soldiers' hands, had learned to function despite the constant presence of death and suffering. When she was captured in the final chaos of the war's end, she had already seen so much horror that she expected capture to be just another terrible chapter in a terrible story. The journey across the Pacific had been grueling. The women were held in a modified cargo hold that was never designed for human habitation. The air was stale and thick. The food was minimal and consisted mostly of rice and saltfish. Some of the women became ill. One developed a severe infection that the American doctors on the ship treated with penicillin, saving her life, an irony that was lost on none of them. Here was the enemy, treating their injuries, keeping them alive, when they had been taught that Americans wanted nothing more than to see them dead. Lieutenant Commander Margaret Foster, a Navy nurse assigned to care for the prisoners, remembered the first time she saw them. "They stood in formation on the deck of the ship when we emerged from the hold," she wrote in her diary. "Their uniforms were torn and filthy. Their faces were hollow with fear and hunger. And their eyes held absolutely no hope. They looked like they had already said goodbye to life." The women whispered among themselves in Japanese, unable or unwilling to speak English. Some prayed quietly. Others maintained rigid military discipline, as if by staying in formation and following orders, they could somehow maintain control of a situation that was completely beyond their control. Akiko stood near the front of the group, her small frame rigid, her face a mask of resignation. She had made peace with the idea of death. She was prepared for the worst. She had already survived so much that nothing could surprise her anymore. But America was about to surprise her in ways she could never have imagined. The processing facility near San Diego was a converted naval barracks that had been hastily prepared to receive Japanese prisoners. The facility was not luxurious, but it was clean and organized. The women were assigned to barracks, given clean uniforms provided with actual beds with mattresses and blankets. They were shown to a medical facility, where they received comprehensive examinations. Doctors checked them for diseases, treated infections, provided medications to those who needed them. The efficiency and care seemed designed specifically to confuse them, to contradict everything they had been told about American treatment of prisoners. The first meal served to the Japanese women prisoners was a revelation in itself. The American soldiers and staff had prepared a simple meal of canned vegetables, bread, butter, and beef stew. It was not elaborate. By American standards, it was routine, nothing special. But for Japanese women who had been living on rations of rice and whatever supplemental food could be scrounged from a war-torn economy, it was a feast beyond imagining. The women ate in silence, mechanical and cautious at first, then with growing urgency as their bodies responded to the availability of real nutrition. Some of them had not tasted meat in years. The taste of butter, of salt, of simple protein overwhelmed their senses. Several women ate so much they became ill afterward, their systems unable to handle such abundance after years of scarcity. Akiko was eating carefully, rationing herself because she could not shake the fear that this abundance was temporary, that it was some kind of trick or test. A young American soldier, Private David Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China, was watching the women eat. He noticed Akiko holding back, eating only small portions despite the clear hunger in her eyes. He approached her cautiously, having been warned by his commanding officer to maintain professional distance from the prisoners. But Chen had his own complicated relationship with war and prejudice and belonging. His family had faced discrimination from Americans who feared Japan, who could not distinguish between the Japanese government and Japanese Americans. He had something in common with these women. He understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy just because of how you looked. He offered Akiko a piece of chocolate, a small Hershey bar that he had been saving from his own rations. He held it out silently, not wanting to startle her with unexpected speech. Akiko stared at the small brown rectangle wrapped in silver foil, as if it were an alien artifact. She had never seen anything like it before. She knew chocolate existed. She had read about it in magazines before the war, but she had never tasted it. Sugar had been rationed severely in Japan, and chocolate was considered an American luxury, something so exotic and foreign that it seemed like a fantasy. She looked up at Private Chen's face, trying to read his intentions. Was this poison? Was this some kind of cruel American trick? His expression was open and kind, without any trace of malice. He simply held out the chocolate and waited. Akiko took it with trembling hands. The foil wrapper crinkled in her grip. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing the small brown bar divided into precise squares. She lifted it to her nose and smelled it, detecting sweetness, cocoa, something she had no frame of reference for. She broke off one small square and placed it in her mouth. The immediate sensation was overwhelming. The sugar hit her taste receptors with an intensity she had never experienced. The cocoa was bitter, but not unpleasantly so, mixed with milk and more sugar. The texture was completely foreign, solid but somehow also melting, leaving a residue on her tongue that was sensuous and strange. She closed her eyes and held the chocolate in her mouth without chewing, just letting it dissolve, letting the flavor spread across every part of her mouth and tongue. And then, to her absolute shock, tears began streaming down her face. Private Chen took a step back, concerned he had done something wrong. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, aware that other prisoners were watching. Akiko could not answer. She could not speak. She could not explain what she was experiencing. The chocolate was just chocolate, just a simple piece of candy. But it represented something so much larger than itself. It represented the fact that her enemy had not killed her. It represented abundance instead of scarcity. It represented someone showing her kindness when she had expected cruelty. It represented the complete collapse of every lie she had been told about America. Other women noticed Akiko's reaction. A few approached Private Chen, curious about what had caused such an extreme emotional response. He offered them each a piece of chocolate, reaching into his pockets and pulling out more bars he had been saving. Word spread quickly through the barracks. The Americans were giving out chocolate, real chocolate, the kind they had only read about in magazines before the war. That evening, the Americans organized an unprecedented event. They distributed chocolate to all 38 women prisoners. Hershey bars, Milky Ways, Snickers, Tootsie Rolls, whatever they had access to through the base commissary. It was a small gesture, a way of acknowledging that the war was over, that these women were no longer enemies but human beings who had experienced trauma and deprivation. The reaction was extraordinary. Many women had the same experience as Akiko. They placed the chocolate in their mouths and began to cry, overwhelmed by the sweetness, by the kindness, by the symbolic meaning of being treated well by their former captors. Keiko Yamamoto, a 31-year-old former radio operator from Osaka, sat on her bunk and held a piece of chocolate in her hand for 5 full minutes before eating it, simply staring at it as if trying to comprehend its existence. When she finally placed it in her mouth, she began to laugh and cry simultaneously, confused and joyful, and terrified all at once. Nurse Yuki Nakamura, who was 42, and remembered the time before industrialization had ravaged Japan's landscape, and before war had consumed everything, described the taste as bringing back memories of her childhood, of simple pleasures, of a time of peace that seemed impossibly distant. She shared her chocolate with 2 younger women who had not yet been given any, breaking it into small pieces so that all 3 of them could experience the sensation together. The Americans watched these reactions with a mixture of emotions. Some of them were confused. It was just chocolate, after all. Why were these women crying? Why were they acting as if they had been given precious jewels? What did this moment mean? Lieutenant Margaret Foster, the Navy nurse who had accompanied the women on the ship, understood immediately. She wrote in her diary that night, "They are crying because they expected cruelty and received kindness. They expected to be treated as enemies and were instead treated as human beings. Chocolate is just chocolate, but it is also a symbol of everything America represents when we choose to be our best selves. These women came here expecting death. Instead, we gave them candy and hot meals and clean beds. The contrast is so extreme that the chocolate became something sacred." Over the following days and weeks, as the Japanese women prisoners remained at the facility, awaiting processing and eventual repatriation, the moment with the chocolate became a kind of turning point in their understanding of America. It forced them to confront the propaganda they had been fed, to acknowledge that American soldiers were not monsters, to accept that there was more complexity in the world than they had been taught. The Americans began to understand something as well. They began to see that treating enemies with basic human dignity was not weakness. It was not naivete. It was a form of strength, a refusal to let war turn them into monsters. It was a choice to be the kind of nation they claimed to be, a nation built on ideals of freedom and human rights. Classes were organized to help the Japanese women learn English. Private Chen volunteered as a teacher, sitting with them and teaching them words, showing them pictures, speaking slowly and clearly. The women were hungry to learn, seeing language as a bridge to understanding, as a way to communicate more fully with the Americans who were treating them with unexpected respect. Akiko became particularly dedicated to learning English. She spent hours in the facility's small library, using a Japanese-English dictionary to work through the books available. She discovered American literature, reading Shakespeare and Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe. She discovered that American culture contained multitudes, that it was not monolithic or propaganda-based but complex and rich and varied. She also discovered that the Americans themselves were complex. They had their prejudices and their flaws. Many of them harbored racist attitudes toward the Japanese. The attitude toward Japanese Americans was particularly fraught, complicated by the internment camps in the United States where Americans of Japanese descent had been imprisoned during the war. But alongside these prejudices existed the capacity for kindness, for humanity, for the recognition that war should not erase our fundamental responsibility to treat other human beings with dignity. A young American soldier named Thomas Murphy befriended Akiko. He was from Brooklyn, the son of Irish immigrants, a man who understood something about being seen as other, about prejudice and discrimination. He taught Akiko slang, taught her American songs, taught her about America's diverse immigrant heritage. He told her that America had failed Japanese Americans, that the government's actions in imprisoning them was a stain on the nation's character. He did not excuse it or minimize it. He simply acknowledged it and expressed the hope that America could do better in the future. Akiko appreciated this honesty more than she could have articulated. It meant that the Americans she met were not claiming to be perfect. They were simply trying to be better. They were acknowledging their flaws while still trying to do right by the people in their power. The chocolate had started something that could not be stopped. Other women began to discover American foods and products. Someone brought canned peaches, and the women experienced fruit that had been preserved in thick sugar syrup, a luxury beyond imagining. Someone shared gum, and the women were fascinated by something that tasted sweet, but was not meant to be swallowed. Someone brought magazines with pictures of American women and American cities, and the prisoners were able to see for themselves that America was not a devastated wasteland, but a land of abundance and opportunity. A box arrived from a church in Ohio, sent by parishioners who had heard about the Japanese women prisoners and wanted to send aid. The box contained personal items: soap, hairbrushes, books, sewing supplies, and more chocolate. Different kinds from different brands: Snickers and Three Musketeers and Milky Ways. The women carefully divided the chocolate, making sure everyone received a piece, making sure that the gift was shared equitably. Keiko, the radio operator from Osaka, wrote to her family in Japan, describing the chocolate and the Americans and her confusion about everything she was experiencing. The letter would take months to reach her family, pass through military censors and international mail systems. When it finally arrived, her mother read it repeatedly, trying to understand what her daughter was describing. Americans giving chocolate to enemy prisoners? It seemed impossible. It seemed like either propaganda or a fantasy. But she trusted her daughter's words, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that perhaps not all Americans were cruel and destructive. The moment with the chocolate became something of a legend among the women. New prisoners who arrived at the facility later, transferred from other locations, would hear the story. The story of how chocolate had arrived like a gift from a god of mercy, how it had convinced women that their enemy was not their enemy at all, how a simple piece of candy had shattered the walls of hatred and fear that years of propaganda had built. By the time repatriation began in September 1945, the women prisoners had been fundamentally changed by their experience. They were not convinced that Japan had been wrong in the war, though some of them had begun to question that assumption. They were not suddenly converts to American ideology or American ways, but they had been shown that humanity could survive even in the midst of terrible conflict. They had been proven wrong about Americans, and they had learned a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Akiko returned to Japan and eventually became a teacher, using her fluent English to teach students about American culture and language. She became an advocate for reconciliation between Japan and America. She told her students about the chocolate, about the American soldier who had shown her kindness when she expected cruelty, about the Navy nurse who had treated her injuries with professionalism and care. She wrote a book later in her life, a memoir of her war experience and her captivity. In the book, she devoted an entire chapter to the moment she had tasted chocolate for the first time. She described it as a moment of spiritual awakening, a moment when she had understood viscerally that the world was more complex and more capable of kindness than she had been taught to believe. I realized, she wrote, that I had been wrong. I had believed everything my government told me without questioning. I had accepted the idea that Americans were monsters without any direct evidence. And then I was given chocolate, and my entire understanding of reality shifted. A government can lie to you. A system can indoctrinate you. But a person handing you a piece of chocolate across the divide of war, a person showing you kindness when hatred would have been more justified, a person refusing to let war completely erase their humanity, that is something that is harder to dismiss. That is what changed me. Keiko never married. She dedicated her life to social work, helping displaced persons and refugees find new homes and new lives. She worked with organizations that helped Japanese Americans who had been in internment camps, helping them rebuild their lives after the war. She saw her work as a way of honoring the Americans who had shown her kindness, as a way of paying forward the debt she felt she owed to people who had refused to let her remain an enemy. Yuki, the oldest of the prisoners, returned to her village in rural Japan and became a local legend. She lived to be 93 and spent her final decades telling the story of the chocolate to anyone who would listen. Young people in her village would come to her small home to hear her describe what it was like to taste something sweet when they expected to taste only bitterness. The moment with the chocolate became significant in ways that no one could have predicted. It became a symbol of reconciliation, of the power of small gestures, of the capacity for humans to choose kindness, even in circumstances where cruelty would have been understandable or even expected. American historians and military officials began to study the case of the Japanese women prisoners. Some concluded that the humane treatment had been good policy, that it had contributed to the success of the post-war occupation of Japan, that it had helped establish the foundation for the American-Japanese alliance that would define the post-war world. Others argued that the treatment was simply right, regardless of strategic considerations, that every human being deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their nationality or the government they had served, that the chocolate was not a strategic move, but a recognition of basic humanity. Thomas Murphy, the young soldier from Brooklyn who had befriended Akiko, left the army after the war and became a social worker. He spent his career trying to bridge cultural divides, trying to help people from different backgrounds understand each other. He often referred to the women prisoners in San Diego when explaining his philosophy. He would say that the moment that most changed his understanding of what humans were capable of was watching a young Japanese woman taste chocolate and begin to cry, watching her comprehend that the world was larger and more complex and more capable of goodness than she had believed. The story of the Japanese women prisoners and the chocolate spread slowly over the decades. It was picked up by historians, by journalists, by people interested in stories of reconciliation and redemption. It became proof of a principle that many wanted to believe was true, that even in humanity's darkest hours, when we are divided by war and hatred and fear, it is still possible to choose kindness, that small gestures can have enormous consequences. That chocolate shared across the divide of war can mean more than all the propaganda in the world. Decades later, when Akiko was invited to speak at a conference about reconciliation and international relations, she held up a small piece of chocolate to the assembled crowd. She told the story of August 1945, of arriving at the facility expecting execution, of the young American soldier with kind eyes, of placing chocolate in her mouth for the first time, and feeling her entire worldview shift. "We talk a lot about grand gestures," she told the audience. "We talk about treaties and agreements and political solutions to conflict, and those things matter. But I will tell you what changed me. What made me willing to reconsider everything I believed about America. It was chocolate, a simple piece of candy that cost perhaps 5 cents, a soldier taking 5 minutes of his time to show kindness to an enemy prisoner. These small things, these simple things, this is how we end wars. Not just the fighting, but the hatred that wars create. We end it by remembering that on the other side of every conflict is a human being. Someone who gets hungry, someone who enjoys sweetness, someone who can be moved to tears by an unexpected act of kindness." The legacy of that moment with the chocolate extended far beyond the 38 women who experienced it. It became a symbol for many of what was possible, what could happen if we chose compassion over revenge, if we treated our enemies as human beings rather than as abstractions, if we believed that even those who fought against us might someday become our friends. In 2000, when the United States and Japan were forging ever deeper ties as allies and economic partners, the story of the chocolate was revived by historians and journalists as an example of the roots of the friendship between the two nations. It showed that reconciliation between enemies was possible, that cultural divides could be bridged, that the scars of war could heal if people were willing to do the work of healing. Akiko Tanaka passed away in 2008 at the age of 86. In her will, she left instructions that a piece of chocolate be placed in the casket with her. She wanted to carry that first taste of American kindness into whatever came next, wanted to honor the moment that had changed everything, wanted to never forget the young soldier with kind eyes who had shown her that her enemy was capable of humanity. Her obituary, which ran in major Japanese newspapers, emphasized her role in post-war reconciliation, but also told the story of the chocolate. Readers across Japan learned about the moment when their friend and neighbor and teacher had been given chocolate and had begun to cry when she had discovered that the world was more complicated and more capable of kindness than she had believed. The chocolate bars that were given to Japanese women prisoners in August 1945 have become artifacts of history. Some are preserved in museums. Some are displayed in the homes of the women who received them, kept as physical reminders of a moment when small gestures changed everything. And still, in the present day, historians, journalists, and ordinary people interested in stories of human transformation return to the question posed by one confused Japanese woman tasting chocolate for the first time in her life. What is this sweet taste? The answer, it turns out, is more complex than simple sugar and cocoa. It is the taste of kindness in the face of hatred. It is the taste of victory won not through domination, but through the recognition of shared humanity. It is the taste of hope that even the deepest divisions created by war can be bridged by small acts of mercy. That is the legacy of the chocolate. That is what it meant when an American soldier handed a piece of candy to an enemy prisoner and changed her understanding of the world. That is the sweetness that lasts far longer than the sugar ever could.